What's up, everybody? My name is Demetri Kofinas, and you're listening to Hidden Forces, a podcast that inspires investors, entrepreneurs, and everyday citizens to challenge consensus narratives and to learn how to think critically about the systems of power shaping our world. My guest in this week's episode is Ryan Gingeras, a professor in the Department of National Security Affairs at the Naval Postgraduate School and an expert on Turkish, Balkan, and Middle East history. In recent years, Turkey has become an X factor of sorts in global politics. Its president, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, has attracted the ire of liberal-minded politicians, and his transactional political style has raised questions about Turkey's dependability as a NATO ally and about its long-term commitment to the rules-based international order. This is obviously a concern for the United States and NATO, but there is perhaps no country for whom Turkey's long-term orientation westward carries more existential importance than Greece, which has been on the receiving end of escalating Turkish provocations and territorial violations of its internationally recognized maritime borders and airspace. And this comes during a time when NATO itself and Turkish cooperation within it has become a bargaining chip of sorts that Ankara has been willing to use in order to further its own strategic objectives, as seen most recently in negotiations over Finnish and Swedish membership. My objective in bringing you this conversation today, why I think it's important, in other words, is twofold. Number one, I want you to understand the historical, political, and geostrategic forces driving Turkish foreign policy today, including the intellectual foundations for its more assertive, revanchist, and perhaps even expansionist ambitions, concepts and doctrines such as strategic depth and Mavi Vatan or blue homeland, which inform and explain much of Turkey's policy in the broader Middle East, Africa, and the Aegean. And number two, I want you to use this opportunity to begin to think more creatively about what the world, and in particular the Middle East, Europe, and North Africa could look like in a world without NATO, or where the post-World War II liberal international order continues to degrade or comes apart entirely. In the case of Turkey, as I've already stated, this has immense, and I'd argue more immediate implications for Greece, which we discuss in depth during the second hour of today's conversation. But over the long term, it risks altering the larger territorial landscape of Eurasia in ways that most people would have found unimaginable at the beginning of the 21st century. What this could mean for citizens in these territories, for the politicians responsible for making policy within the various countries affected, and for investors and businesses looking to put capital to work in them cannot be understated. As most of you already know, Hidden Forces is listener supported. I don't rely on advertisers or commercial sponsors. So if you want full access to our entire content library, including the second hour of today's episode, as well as the transcripts and intelligence reports, head over to hiddenforces.io, select the episode that you're interested in listening to, and click on the premium extras, where you can then sign up to one of our premium content tiers. And with that, please enjoy this incredibly educational episode with my guest, Ryan Gingeras. Ryan Gingeras, welcome to Hidden Forces.
Thank you very much for having me.
It's great having you on, Ryan. So before we start, tell me a little bit about your background. What got you interested in studying Turkish history and current affairs in the Balkans and in the Middle East?
I've always loved history, and into my teen years, I became more interested in politics and global affairs. And, you know, in the mid-90s, the event that kind of most interested me, shaped my historical and political interests was former Yugoslavia, and specifically the civil war in Yugoslavia. And it was a place that just fascinated me. And among the things that really fascinated me about, you know, the history of Yugoslavia was its relationship to the Ottoman Empire. And so the long story short is I kind of discovered Turkey by way of books, through traveling. And after my very first trip there, I just fell in love with it. I fell in love with the people. You know, the country is endlessly fascinating from east to west in terms of the various, parts of it. Culture is really wonderful. And there's lots of different rabbit holes one can explore, whether you're talking about, the contemporary issues or the deep past. And, that's what has sustained me, despite the fact that I don't really have any personal connection with the place.
Well, what do you think people least understand or get most wrong about Turkey and about the nature of its national identity and how the politics of that identity and of the country's national aspirations play out?
Yeah, it's a good question. I would say up front that, from the inside looking out, I often get the impression that Turks see themselves as misunderstood, broadly speaking. I don't think it's just one issue. I think it's lots of different issues. I would say the most fundamental thing people tend to get wrong about Turkey is this country of dichotomies, whether it's a country of East and West, Islam or secular, or, Europe or not Europe. I don't necessarily think Turks see themselves as defined by these kinds of binaries. I think that Turkey, and personally, just from the outside looking in, Turkey is a country and a people that is at home with different ideas of culture, different ideas of politics, different types of, even just setting where it situates itself in the world, and is at home with these kinds of contradictions. It's not necessarily a binary choice or a kind of war of all against all in terms of, two different diametrically opposed places or ideas. I think it's actually like lots of places. It's a place that is beset by contradictions and is rather happy with ambiguity.
Well, how would you say that Turkish history or Ottoman history and also the history of Turkey after World War II have informed its orientation? Because I would argue, and I'm curious what your thoughts are on this, that Turkey has been oriented more westward during the course of the last 70 years from a security standpoint. That, in other words, its positioning in NATO, and I don't actually know off the top of my head, maybe you can tell us when Turkey joined NATO, but its positioning in NATO has been an important part of its geostrategic positioning overall in the world. And for a long time, Turkey was also vying to join the European Union. The fact that that eventually didn't happen has also had implications for its orientation. But I'm just curious to understand that from your perspective, the history and its westward orientation, because I think that has come into question in recent years, as has Turkey's commitment to the future of the rules-based international order.
I think the most succinct way to kind of get at this is, how do Turks necessarily look at history as a roadmap for the present? And, history is really fiercely debated in Turkey. I would say actually of all the main kind of culture war-like red lines in the country, they're historical ones. It's the ways in which people, think about certain individuals or certain periods or the importance of certain moments in the country's making, as well as kind of the broader trends in the making of the country. I mean, these are things that are just fiercely, fiercely debated. And, to your kind of question about the country's strategic orientation, I think the most important thing to understand is that up until World War I, the country most certainly existed as a player, as a factor in great power politics in Europe. Certainly it was a focus of great power politics. I mean, it was a battlefield of great power politics for, a number of centuries, if you think about it this way. It's an interlocutor within European politics for a long period of time, but it's not necessarily a state that has long-standing, strong relationships either with its neighbors or with other major powers. It's much more historically transactional, or it's been at various times frozen outside of the interlocking alliances of great powers. And, we could there are certain exceptions to this rule. Turks like to point out, for example, that, in the 1500s, Turkey and France were allies, actually having fought wars together during this period of time. But I mean, the longstanding rule is that, Turkey is historically isolated as a power. Now, this, it hits this abrupt transition with World War I when it joins the Central Powers. It joins Germany, it joins Austria-Hungary in the First World War and pays for it, right? And pays for it probably, one could argue, of all the losing powers in World War I, it pays the steepest price. It loses a significant amount of its territory. It is almost occupied by the victorious powers. It stands the greatest amount to gain as a result of the peace agreement at Versailles. But within a space of a couple of years, the tables are turned, right? With the emergence of Ataturk, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, there is a resurgence inside of the Ottoman Empire that forces the victorious allies to renegotiate the peace treaty. And it's this thing that sets up the Republic of Turkey. Okay, that's Turkish history, in the longue durée, in so many words. Now, in terms of its security orientation, one of the biggest lessons Ataturk's generation took away was don't enter wars, right? Don't enter big global power wars because Turkey has the greatest amount to lose. And this is still something that a lot of Turks, I would say, are still very sensitive to, that if you pick a side among the major powers, Turkey only loses. It doesn't necessarily gain. So, in 1952, when Turkey joins NATO, it appears that, Turkey now is forced in a rather difficult predicament because of the Soviet Union's real surge in influence and in terms of demands upon Europe, upon its immediate periphery. And those demands were actually made very directly of Turkey. Stalin demanded the renegotiation of the Treaty of Montreux, which controls the straits, the Turkish straits between the Black Sea and the Aegean, demanded territory of Turkey. This is among probably the two most important factors that brings Turkey into NATO. And it's that relationship that set Turkey up over the next several decades as having not just a far more Western-oriented security policy, but one that is framed within this collective security agreement that is NATO. And it was very much defined by this very specific moment in time, by the early 1950s. The fact of the matter is, since the breakup of the Soviet Union, the nature of Turkey's security orientation hasn't necessarily been about the issue of East or West, US or not the US. It's been really about internal security. If you were to ask a Turk, what is the biggest issue that scares you in terms of the security of the country's future, they would say terrorism. They would say specifically the influence of the Kurdish Workers' Party, or the PKK, which is this terrorist organization that has been at war with Turkey since the mid-1980s. And so it's that issue, almost singularly, that has defined the way Turkey sees its security relationship with the outside world. In short, the Turks' view of NATO, the United States, and a lot of other actors in the world is through this prism of what can this body do for us vis-a-vis the PKK?
That's fascinating. So I have a couple of questions. First of all, can you please clarify, when you talk about the threat of political terrorism, is that also really a threat about the integrity of their state? Because this isn't just a situation like most Americans, for example, or Europeans, let's say, might think when they hear terrorism, they might think these singular one-off events meant to influence our domestic politics. But in the case of Turkey, there are huge Kurdish populations both within Turkey and outside of Turkey. And the Kurds don't really have their own nation state. I mean, they've got northern Iraq, there are parts of northern Syria, and the war in Syria has been a huge geopolitical unknown for the country, and American foreign policy in Syria has also played a big role. So one, can you clarify the political terrorism component, and then answer for me how important the war in Syria has been for changing Turkish foreign policy and its relationship towards the United States?
It's a great question, and I would try to frame it this way. One of the most elementary things a young Turkish person in school learns is that historically the country has been surrounded by enemies, and that within the country it has a history of separatism, treason, what have you. Now, in contemporary Turkey, yes, there are large numbers of Kurds that live in the country. And as you pointed out, yes, Kurds are found throughout the Middle East. They're found in Turkey, they're found in Iraq, they're found in Syria, they're found in Iran. And the Kurdish population of Turkey is sizable. The cliche is that it's around 20% of the population, and it's not necessarily concentrated. It's most certainly that Turks are concentrated in the historic lands that they are found, which is in the southeastern part of the country. But arguably the largest Kurdish cities in the country are Istanbul and Ankara, the largest cities in the country. And there's really large numbers of Kurds who would like to renegotiate their relationship with the Turkish state in some way, shape, or form. It's not necessarily independence. It could be some kind of autonomy. It could be something as simple as greater amounts of cultural rights. Now, from the standpoint of large numbers of Turks, giving any single group, an ethnic group, greater amounts of autonomy is one step along the road that eventually leads to separatism of some kind. And this is a lesson that is reinforced time and time again in Turkish education. And, this is precisely the historical lesson that is drawn from the history of Turkey's relationship with Greece. Greece represents kind of the primary example of a people that long have this historical relationship, but ultimately tries to bring about the undoing of the Ottoman Empire, of the Turkish state, and so on. Okay, so that's sort of the critical framework here. So it's through this prism, again, that lots of Turks see the issue of security. And so it's through this prism that lots of Turks see Syria as a kind of battlefield or as an extension of what it sees as an existential struggle over the integrity of the Turkish state. So in northern Syria, yes, you have large numbers of Kurds. These Kurds are largely concentrated along the northeastern part of the country in what Kurds call Rojava, which is the western part of the historic Kurdish lands of historic Kurdistan. This area is governed by a group that is, organically linked to the PKK, to the Kurdish Workers' Party, a group that is now allied with the United States because it is a group that has joined an alliance with the United States to try to suppress, destroy ISIS.
You're talking about the YPG?
Yes, the YPG and SDF are the two main military wings of the overarching group. One thing that you learn very quickly about Kurdish politics, there are lots of acronyms, there are lots of splinter groups. That's why I try not to kind of get too much in the weeds here. But anyway, all said and done, the fact that the United States established this relationship with the YPG, with this Syrian Kurdish organization, it's a double stab in the back in this regard. Number one, Turks don't see any difference between the YPG and the PKK at large. It's a separatist organization. It aims to break up Turkey, full stop. It's a terror organization, full stop. Number two, the fact that the United States would retain this relationship in and of itself harks back in the minds of lots of Turks of the episodes in its past, specifically in the latter decades of the Ottoman Empire, where great powers supported the autonomous or separatist demands of major ethnic groups within the country, right? Within the Ottoman Empire, whether it's Armenians or Greeks or Arabs, these sorts of groups that demand autonomy and are backed by great powers. This is a recipe for the breakup of the Ottoman Empire, and in turn is interpreted as a recipe for the breakup of Turkey. So just fundamentally, the relationship that the United States describes as fundamentally one of mutual convenience and mutual interests, and therefore relatively limited. Turkey doesn't see it that way.
So I just want to mention to listeners that if they're interested in learning a bit more about the nature of the U.S. Turkish-Kurdish relationship, that we did 2 episodes on this a couple of years ago, one with Joshua Landis and one with Jake Hanrahan, both incredibly interesting. And I think it was around the time that the Turks, I believe, unilaterally went into northern Syria, into Rojava. So how has that changed the nature of the relationship between the U.S. and Turkey? How has it created fractures in that relationship? And how has the United States responded to that? And I want to also pull in the latest news, which is that Turkey gave sort of, again, somewhat conditional support to Finland and Sweden's entry into NATO. And as part of the the negotiations, they were given some kind of assurances around political terrorism and organizations like the YPG and the PKK. So kind of flesh that out for me and help fill in the thread of continuity from 2019 to today.
Yeah, so the first Turkish incursion to Syria is in 2016, and it occurs within a little over a month after the attempted coup against Erdogan.
Which is also hugely important and we haven't talked about. You might want to also fill in accordingly information related to the coup as well.
Right, exactly. And so, I mean, it follows this trope that we've sort of talked about a little bit, that when, Turks today talk about the attempted coup in 2015, they talk about it not simply as a political event aimed at Erdogan, but represents a societal rift, right? A certain kind of polarization within the country. And that polarization centers on the historic influence of, this is where it gets a little complicated, sort of a fraternal organization. It's not quite a sect. Rather, it's a movement that is based on the teachings of a cleric that just so happens to lives in northeastern Pennsylvania, a cleric by the name of Fethullah Gulen, who established this organization called Hizmet, or service, right? This is a group that is more generally known as the Gulenists. And the Gulenist movement was exceedingly popular and exceedingly influential in Turkey and really, in various countries around the world going into 2016. But Fethullah Gulen, his followers, had a fallout with Erdogan's government in the preceding years before the coup. Now, long story short is the coup was very quickly blamed on the influence of the Gulenists, and specifically a Gulenist faction within the Turkish military, within the Turkish state at large. And, one thing I would argue, and I think other people who follow Turkey, study Turkey would tend to agree, is that this, again, hits upon this trope that is really deeply, it exercises an incredible amount of influence over the way Turks see themselves, see their past, is that Turkey is a country that is internally divided into different factions, as well as into different secret cabals, as well as a country that is historically riven by acts of treason, acts of separatism, acts of subterfuge. And so a Turkish citizen can very easily believe that there was a secret cabal made up that formed this mass movement that tried to take over the country, that not simply tried to unseat Erdogan, but really kind of transform the country from the inside out. And the fact that it's a movement whose leader lives in the United States, and we could sort of talk about some of the details of this, but Fethullah Gulen has lived in the United States for decades. He was, in fact, went into exile as a result of the political persecution against the Gulenist movement going back to the 1990s, well before Erdogan was president. So, the fact that he is based in the United States has led, and this is something that's very much, promoted and orchestrated by the government as well, has led many people to believe that the coup is actually an American-inspired coup, or that the United States ordered the coup. So, coupled with what I just said about Kurds, Syrian Kurds, the situation in Syria, when Turkey invaded Syria in August of 2016, in some ways, these two separate threads become intertwined. And the thing that really joins the two threads is the United States. The idea that now Turkey is taking proactive action to try to shift the political situation in Syria in its favor in a way that actually encroaches on, kind of U.S. interests or sort of U.S. policy in Syria, which is to try to stabilize it, try to utilize its relationship with the YPG as a way of suppressing ISIS, and to try, at the very best it can, to mollify Turkey's fears by saying, time and time again, yes, we have this relationship with the YPG, but it is a limited one. It is an entirely transactional one. We denounced the coup. The United States has offered to assist in any kind of extraditional efforts towards Fethullah Gulen. But the fact is, and this is even links now back to the case of Sweden and Finland, that you left off on. Going back to 2016, as it's understood, the evidence that Ankara has provided to try to see Fethullah Gulen extradited to the country is not only old, it's terribly flawed.
The evidence that he was involved, or the evidence that this was also part of a U.S.-led or U.S. participating initiative?
Unclear. But generally speaking, that he is involved in the coup, but that most importantly, that he is involved with kind of nefarious issues within Turkey, right? The evidence that has supposedly been presented among justice officials in Washington, it would not necessarily stand up in court. So this is a key problem. And it's something that if you're following events now in terms of Turkey's relationship with Sweden and to some extent Finland, there's supposedly a list of 73 people that Turkey wants extradited to Turkey from Sweden. But, the fact of the matter is, the evidence that supposedly has been provided in some of these cases, again, this is sort of according to news reporting, is that it's flawed. It would not necessarily stand up in a Swedish court. And, this has led to a major blockage in the case of the United States and would likely, unless, something radically changes in Sweden, likely lead to a similar blockage in the case of Sweden's ascension into NATO.
This is so fascinating, and you've done such an amazing job just beginning to lay out the complexity that not only is the Middle East and American policy in the Middle East as the global order is changing, but in Turkish political society and history. I mean, in so many ways, Turkey, because of its geolocation between East and West, its positioning at the Dardanelles, I mean, it really captures so many of the changing geopolitical dynamics of the last 20 years and America's shift away from the Middle East as a result of a combination of factors, including its energy independence. So I want to see which thread I want to pull on here first. First of all, in terms of the evidence, let's just zero in on U.S. involvement. Is there any evidence, compelling evidence, to support the claims or the suspicions among factions in Turkey that the United States or U.S. intelligence services were involved in the coup?
No.
What's the logical argument that would be used to support the thesis that the U.S. was involved? Like, why would the U.S. favor a coup against Erdogan? What would there be to gain? What's the argument there?
Well, first of all, I should say off the top that, I am an employee of the Department of Defense. Everything I'm saying here is entirely my opinion. That's
a great disclaimer to make, actually.
Yeah. And so, what I'm about to say, this is not, by any stretch of the means, an expression of government policy or government interpretation of these events. I think the first thing one has to consider is the accusations that have been levied in the Turkish press from virtually the time of the coup. The first and foremost piece of evidence that Turks point to regarding potential U.S. complicity is the fact that Fethullah Gulen is based in the United States. He is a green card holder, and that his application, in fact, was backed by a former station chief in Ankara from the CIA. Now, it should be said that his arrival to the United States, his presence in the United States, was something that came at a time in which not only was Fethullah Gulen the victim of political oppression on the part of the Turkish government, but so was Erdogan, as well as other members of what is now the Turkish government. So to say somehow that this was a relationship that was cultivated going way back as a way of undermining Turkey kind of defies the fact that, lots of different, specifically Islamist groups, were the target of suppression by the Turkish government in, the 1990s and so on. The second issue that Turks often point to is that, for example, there were, at the time of the coup in 2016, the presence of American citizens in Turkey who, in some way, shape, or form, helped lead the coup. Okay. Now, there has been no evidence of this, evidence that these individuals played any direct role in the coup at all. It's just simply the fact that they were in the country, and that's it. So beyond this, a lot of it is simply by association. The United States is responsible for coups in the past, not in Turkey so much, but in the world at large. the fact that Turkey is a country that is vitally important to the United States, and that Turkey, in the minds of many Turks, is seen as an enemy of the United States, that Americans actually have some sort of innate animus to Turkey, and therefore stand to benefit from the coup. And again, that Erdogan as an individual is seen as a leader, whether you like him or not, who promotes Turkish interests and therefore stands as an adversary to the United States. And so it's really a kind of guilt by association that is mostly the main line of argument that lies at the heart of these accusations.
This is so fascinating for so many reasons. So, there is this powerful strain of anti-Westernism, and in particular, anti-Americanism within Turkish governing circles and the public. I'm curious to understand, besides, is it just the Ottoman history that explains this? I mean, or has it taken on a life of its own? Because in some sense, this strain of anti-Americanism also exists, though I imagine to a much lesser degree, in Greek society. This suspicion of American foreign policy. So how much of that is, because in the case of Greece, you're talking about a country that besides, okay, yes, we can talk about the junta in the late 60s and 70s, but Greece in its founding DNA is a beneficiary of Western alliances and diplomatic wrangling in using particular Britain and France in its founding to help create the foundations of the modern Greek nation state. So I'm curious to understand really what explains this anti-Westernism, because it also runs directly through Russian society. And I think that shared common experience is one of the reasons that Erdogan has been able to really take advantage of that relationship with Putin, especially since the 2016 coup. So explain that for me. Help me and my listeners understand its origins.
It's a great question. What I would say is that it is a combination of certain broader trends globally, but I think is an even stronger source, an even stronger point of origin is the unique individual histories that you see in comparison between Greece and Turkey. On the one hand, when we look at the origins of anti-Americanism, especially during the time of the Cold War, a lot of it is linked to American policy or policies that are associated with the United States or associated with the Western Bloc in these countries that were anti-leftist. So in the case of Greece and in the case of Turkey, anti-leftist policies were among the factors that led to the coups in the case of Greece, as well in the case of Turkey in the 70s and the 1980s. So where anti-Americanism was strongest in Turkey historically is among the left. Okay. One thing that I think where the Greece and Turkey began to diverge in terms of its relationship with the United States and in terms of the kind of the cultivation of a really quite, in Turkey's case, almost universal anti-American consensus or American antagonism consensus came about as with the Gulf War in 2003. The war was absolutely shattered pro-American sentiment in the country. And I have to say, I mean, I spent a fair amount of time in Turkey during this period of time, both before the war and after. And the change in consensus was rather striking. It didn't happen overnight, but within, between, 2001, 2002, kind of the first times I've ever went to Turkey, to, kind of the initial years after the invasion between 2003 and say 2006, impressions of the United States really began to change. And I think it's for a number of reasons. I think number one, Turks, like lots of people in the world, were horrified at the unilateralism of the invasion, horrified by the scale of the violence, horrified for the fact that the U.S. planned for regime change, and the fact that the Bush administration made no secret that it planned to transform the Middle East in radical ways, again, hark back to aspects of Turkish history, of Ottoman history, that seemed to bear some resemblance right? And in that, what the United States was planning was something akin to, say, and again, sort of the way a lot of Turks thought about it, the redrawing of the map akin to the end of the First World War, right? The way in which the great powers of the First World War broke up the Ottoman Empire and established these, puppet regimes in Iraq and in Syria and in Lebanon. That all sort of seemed like a blueprint for what the United States was doing. So that was the second part. And the third part, again, goes back to Kurds, that, with the invasion and its aftermath, the United States openly allied itself with Kurdish factions in northern Iraq, which brought about the creation of the Kurdish Regional Government, or the KRG. And so, Kurds today in northern Iraq live in a kind of a semi-autonomous state of their own that is referred to as Kurdistan, a term that on and off in Turkish history has been even illegal. It's been illegal to refer to it. It's illegal to have an organization named, with the name Kurdistan in it. And so these factors taken together really brought about a strong anti-American shift. And if you were to look at opinion polls before 2003 and after, American opinions of the United States just tank in Turkey. Now, things have only gotten worse since. The reasons is because of these issues that we just talked about, 2016 coup, issues in Syria. And I think the last factor, if you're going to compare it to Greece, is that Erdogan his allies have made a point to continue to cultivate an antagonistic worldview towards the United States. And I don't think this has necessarily been the case of Greek governments consistently, especially in the last several decades, where this has been a more consistent force in shaping Turkish opinions. And that is the role of Erdogan himself, the role of his allies in the media, as well as, I think, even the kind of the zeitgeist that has taken hold of the country that you see in popular culture, which, again, Turkey the media environment is highly restricted. And even though, if you look at a lot of these shows that you can even find on Netflix that don't necessarily have anything that is explicitly geared towards the United States or is anti-American in its nature, the worldview of, let's say, Turks fighting against outside powers, Turks fighting for their independence, Turks as an emerging powerful force in the making of the world, those sorts of tropes do mimic or mirror the broader political consensus that has in its crosshairs the United States as its main antagonist.
So was this also, because Erdogan also saw it as a political opportunity to become the de facto leader of the Muslim world, and the Arab Spring also, I think, gave him a sense of opportunity around that, something that has changed in the years since with the decline of, I guess, support for Al-Qaeda and some of these various Islamic factions. Is that generally correct as well, that he saw that as an opportunity and one that he's since pivoted from as a result of these changes and the dynamics in the Middle East?
It's a really good question. And among the challenges to answer that question is, how did Erdogan think about himself as a foreign policy actor, let's say, before 2012? Here, there's a little bit of debate. What is pretty clear is after 2012, Erdogan began to play a much more proactive role as a presumptive leader of not simply the Islamic world. This is not necessarily a term he would use, but in essence, a leader of the global South, right? A leader of a major non-Western leader that is not simply one that is influential or possesses some sort of gravitas, but leads a broad coalition that is revisionist, that it has as its unifying force a desire to push back influence of the West that seemed to be maligned. And that the evolution of that kind of persona in Erdogan's case took time post 2012. Now, I want to say that, before 2012, Turkey under Erdogan, developed a far more active foreign policy. And this is something that, for those of us who followed Turkey at this time, was really exciting and really, endlessly fascinating. And we saw, roughly between, say, the, early 2000s to, again, 2012 is kind of a usual kind of turning point, or used as a usual turning point. The emergence of a Turkey that was just far more present in the international arena. Whereas before, it was a more modest, it was a more demure state. And you could see this in lots of different ways. I mean, before Erdogan took on the premiership within Turkey, its presence diplomatically was limited. There are lots of countries around the world that didn't have a Turkish embassy. You didn't see a prime minister or a Turkish, president is historically a ceremonious role that was transformed by Erdogan himself. But you never saw senior Turkish leaders as a kind of, playing a kind of bridge or deal-making role, or let alone kind of being a major autonomous force in the world at large. Erdogan's Turkey changes this kind of approach towards foreign policy, one that is more self-confident, but before 2012, one that was geared more towards the exercise of soft power, and one that saw itself as a kind of mediator, between major powers, specifically Western powers, and other regions of the world. Okay. Post 2012, that approach towards foreign policy begins to change. Eventually, what we get up to by, sort of the late 2010s, early 2020s, is a Turkey that is far more not simply self-confident, but really, I guess Turks would call it unbridled in the ways in which it would use both soft and hard power to exercise influence, to be a presence on the global stage, and to do so with little deference, right? Little deference to the United States, to Europe, and a willingness to be disliked for it. And certainly a part of this is geared towards the Islamic world. But I think in Erdogan's heart of hearts, and I would say this would also be true of a broad cross-section of Turkey, Turkish leadership is not, seen as something that should be restricted to other predominantly Muslim states. I think if possible, Turkey would like to be a larger state within the non-Western world. And one item of evidence that you see is Turkey's increased role within sub-Saharan Africa. And that, Turkey sees itself as a potential player in places where, larger states, specifically Western states, have, let's just say, a poor track record, and this would be essentially the case of sub-Saharan Africa.
So this also speaks to this concept of strategic autonomy, which I think is a great place to focus next. Just to wrap this up, I want to say that we did an excellent episode with Soner Chaptai a few years ago, and it was focused very much on Erdogan. So while I would love to explore Erdogan more here, and wherever it's appropriate, we'll do so, we did devote one single episode to him, so I definitely want to direct listeners to that. But let's actually switch a little bit here, because I mentioned strategic autonomy. There's also some other concepts in Turkish society that are really important in national security circles. One is strategic depth. Another one, more recent one, is the blue homeland. I want to understand all of these and their significance within the factions of Turkish national security circles, because I also want to try and understand what that consensus is, because you've got the Kemalists, you've got kind of the nationalists, you've got, I guess, these quasi-conservative, maybe more religious factions. And of course, I mentioned Kemalists, you have the Turkish military, which has historically been a very powerful secular force in Turkish society. So help me understand the intellectual foundations and cross-currents of Turkish national security and geostrategic thinking within the country, and what the factions are that support this initiative or this sort of direction. Because in my studying of the politics of the country, it seems that this is a majoritarian position, that the majority of Turkish society, including parts of the public, support this kind of orientation.
Right. I mean, I think the first thing to state up front is that the notion of a kind of doctrinaire approach towards foreign policy is relatively new. I say relatively because there is a historic doctrine within not simply security policy, but broader sort of foreign relations that is chalked up to this adage or cliche that comes from Ataturk, which is peace at home, peace in the world.
Tell our listeners who Kemal Ataturk is.
Oh, of course. Sure. Mustafa Kemal Ataturk was the founding president of Turkey. Turkey's founded in 1923. Ataturk is not only the founding president of the country, but laid out a reformist agenda that was aimed at creating a new national identity for the peoples of what is today Turkey, an identity that is grounded in ethnic consciousness, the idea that everybody living in Turkey is a Turk, and that to be a Turk means not simply to be Turkish, it also means to have a very specific kind of relationship to Islam, right? We often think of this as a kind of secular relationship with Islam. And that the dogmas of his reign, and he rules from 1923 to 1938, the dogmas of his reign are etched out not only in law, it's not only etched out in education, it is a profound social and cultural force, right? It shapes the way lots of people not only see politics, not only see culture, it's the way they see themselves. Okay. I mean, it's, for an American audience in particular, I would say, Turkey has had a long-standing culture war. And among the sites of this culture war is, what is your relationship to Ataturk? What's your relationship to Mustafa Kemal? And the conceit of it in legal and political terms is that everybody should love Mustafa Kemal. But the reality is that's not the case, right? So when we talked about kind of doctrinaire approaches or kind of ideological approaches to foreign policy, the core one, like the historic one, is this cliche that comes down from Ataturk: peace at home, peace in the world. What does that mean? It means everything and nothing. Now, it's often been rationalized as, by historic elites as having let's say, a collectivist approach towards security, an approach towards the West that is conciliatory. But still, nonetheless, again, it's open-ended. It depends who you ask. But historically, it means also that Turkey would somehow retain friendly relations, good relations with everybody else. Okay. Now, in the 2000s, as I mentioned, there is this revolution of sorts in Turkish foreign policy. And it's one that is sanctioned by Erdogan, and it's guided by his foreign minister, a guy by the name of Ahmet Davutoglu, who is the architect of this foreign policy that, as mentioned, is really expansive. It's really ambitious. It's aimed to catapult Turkey into a new kind of status in the world at large as a kind of global deal maker, global bridge builder, but most importantly, a global force of influence.
And Ahmet Davutoglu's contribution to all of this was specifically the concept of strategic depth?
Strategic depth and zero problems. Those are the new two cliches that kind of enter into Turkish diction in the mid-2000s. The idea is that Turkey is a country that has historical relationships with lots of different places around the world, most notably within the peoples of the Middle East, but also in Southeastern Europe and everywhere because of the influence of the Ottoman Empire. Like, that's it in a nutshell, right? Why is Turkey well positioned to play such a role? Well, because of its history, its geography, its kind of cultural relations with various peoples around the world. That's the argument. Part two of the argument, this idea of zero problems, more relates to the actual approach towards foreign policy. And that is to find avenues of influence that would lead to strong relations, but also lead to durable relationships. And Erdogan really is a promoter in this period of time during the mid-2000s, again, with Ahmet Davutoglu as kind of the main spokesperson, the kind of the front man of this, sees this mostly in economic terms, right? The creation of Turkey as a kind of export hub and, site of attracting foreign direct investment. And it's this framework that kind of governs, Turkey's foreign policy. And obviously the thing that you're hearing here is not a lot of emphasis on security. Well, this changes in the aftermath of not only the Arab Spring, but more specifically in the aftermath of the war in Syria. That what we see specifically by the outbreak of the war in Syria is an increased attentiveness in Ankara towards security concerns that are not restricted solely to issues pertaining to the PKK and Kurds, right? There's a civil war going on next door. It's one that is attracting the influence of Iran, the United States, Israel, eventually Russia. And so, Turkey is put in this position where, there's this war going on next door. It's attracting virtually every major power that has a military, both regional and international. And so Turkey is kind of forced to play a role in this crisis that is beyond just simply the issue of soft power, right? And the unwinding of this approach that Davutoglu innovates, kind of has other points of origin as well. But I would say this is the main point of origin. Is where it's, I would say this more than anything is the beginning of an increasingly securitized approach towards foreign policy, away from the kind of emphasis on trade or investment, and more towards, the building up of a Turkey that, is able and willing to use hard force to achieve its ends. Now, you mentioned the issue of the blue homeland, okay? And this being a really important emerging framework for Turkish security. Interestingly enough, that has a parallel origin story that is somewhat divorced from everything I just talked about. And in a lot of ways, reflects an internal politics that isn't so much ideological as it is institutional within the Turkish military. So allow me to, if I may, back up just a minute. Now, the Turkish military, as you mentioned, exercises a historically profound influence on Turkish politics. Turkey has a history of multiple coups, going back to the country's origins, and even before that, during the Ottoman Empire, the strongest institution in Turkey was the military. Right? Now, the fact is, though, that the military as a fighting force, as a force that does something other than just kind of rules, but not necessarily governs in political terms, as a fighting force, it's always been defined by threats that are, let's just say, terrestrial. They're land threats. Terrorism is a threat that threatens the Turkish countryside. It threatens it territorially. It threatens people personally in that respect. Turkey, however, is a country that borders 3 seas. It also occupies an important place within international traffic in that it, stands really close to the Eastern Mediterranean and the Suez Canal. And more importantly, it holds custody over the Turkish Straits, over the Bosphorus and Dardanelles, which connects the Black Sea to the Aegean, right? So these are, despite these important traits, Turkey has never had a very influential, let's just say, kind of naval consensus within foreign policy circles. It's always played second fiddle to the army. But more importantly, I work for the Navy, and this is a very Navy-like term. Turkey has historically a very bad case of sea blindness. It just simply has historically ignored or largely ignored issues related to maritime security or its potential as a maritime power.
What accounts for that, the fact that it has ignored those things?
I would say institutionally, it has to do with the fact that in security terms, the army drives the bus. And that when people think about ways in which Turkey is insecure, its land borders are insecure because of the threat of terrorism, because of the threat.
The terrestrial security concerns simply sucked up all the oxygen for thinking about strategic threats and advantages.
That's right. But it's also, I think, all armies are, mindful of their fiefdoms. And fight for attention and budgets and all of that. And the army was, kind of commanded almost the entirety of the agenda in terms of security issues. Now, going back, it's a long story. I'm going to try to summarize, but, there seems to be a change in the 2000s, okay, within the military itself, specifically within the Navy. And what you have senior admirals, senior leaders in the Navy who say, look, we need to present a new kind of story to Turks about the importance of the Navy. And they do so in 2 discrete ways. The most known way is the cultivation of this new strategic framework called Blue Homeland, or Mavi Vatan in Turkish. And in essence, Blue Homeland as a policy means this. Turkey is a country that, again, borders 3 seas, lies in this strategically vital place on planet Earth. That alone should command the government and people to pay more attention to maritime security. But beyond that, it is a framework. This blue homeland is a framework to think about Turkey's exclusive economic zone, its EEZ, in the same way as it thinks about its land borders, right? Turkish soil is sacred, right? Every square inch of it within its borders. What proponents of the blue homeland doctrine say is we need to think about our exclusive economic zone in the exact same way. Now, the rub is that the proponents of this doctrine etch out a map of Turkey's exclusive economic zone. In short, is in defiance of international law and intrudes on the territorial interests of neighboring states, most notably Greece and the Republic of Cyprus. So here is where, it kind of really rather kind of milquetoast, quite nerdy approach, let's just say, towards security kind of hits, home in a really deep and emotive way. In that proponents of the blue homeland argue, look, our interests, our blue homeland, we have our terrestrial homeland, we have our soil, but our seas, the integrity of our seas, our claims to the ocean are threatened by our historic enemies, the Greeks, right? Greeks in Cyprus, Greeks in Greece. And so we need to take a far more aggressive and proactive role in asserting the sovereignty over our legitimate, maritime space, over our seas. And so this call has now inspired a far more proactive, a far more, frankly, quite militant approach towards maritime policy that really, and not necessarily completely, but really seems to break past precedents in terms of the way Turkey has behaved on the international stage.
So, Ryan, first of all, you've really done a phenomenal job here thus far, kind of laying the foundation for the second part of our conversation, which I want to move us to. But before we do that, I really want to kind of lay out a few things and kind of give listeners a sense of where I want to take this conversation or where it might go. First of all, I just want to also point out, as a Greek citizen, and my memory and recollection of the 1990s especially, was actually very good relations with Turkey, especially after the earthquake diplomacy that happened. And we were obviously in a very different security environment at the time. But what it feels like to me is when you say, for example, the historical enemies of Turkey being Greece, it also seems to me, and I'd love for you to comment on this on the second part, if this is something that, I guess, organically that feeling has come up, or how much it's kind of suited Turkish politics to think of it in those terms, because for a long time in contemporary history, Greek and Turkish relations didn't quite feel that way. So that's just kind of one thing I wanted to throw out there. I want to also make the larger observation that what it feels like is happening here in Turkish society is that the country is trying to really come to a deep national sense of who they are in this new world, a world that's very quickly changing, moving away from a sort of unipolar American hegemony where rules-based international institutions like NATO are an essential part of the framework, to one where Turkey, again, has much more autonomy and has much more to gain and to lose in this world. And really what you're seeing is that rich tapestry of conversation, interest groups, factions, etc., which I think we've done a very good job of kind of beginning to capture here. In the second part of our conversation, I want to, of course, talk about Greece, because the situation with Greece is very serious in my view, and certainly for Greek citizens, it's of existential importance. I don't know if Greece can hope to maintain its territorial integrity and its sovereign independence if it doesn't make significant changes to how it handles both its diplomatic relationship, which I think it has been doing. I mean, in its relationship with France, and certainly Mitsotakis is trying to engage the Americans, but I don't know how much they can rely on diplomacy without actually investing more significantly in their military and maybe taking a kind of a turn that looks much more like what the Israelis have than what they've been doing for a long time, because not just because they would need to be able to defend themselves in the Eastern Mediterranean, but also because a stronger Greek military and a stronger Greek national security state has something to offer to the Europeans and to NATO that can help on the diplomatic front. I mean, there's a very complicated dilemma that the Greeks face. I also want to talk about, to the extent that we have the time, again, we're going to talk about pathways of escalation and de-escalation in the Aegean and between Greece and Turkey, but I also want to discuss the other bilateral relationships in a bit more detail, including Turkish relations to China, and especially Russian-Turkish relations, and how the war in Ukraine has accelerated some of the trends that we talked about, how it potentially stands as a bulwark in the sense that Turkey has historically feared the Russian threat. Russian-Turkish relations have not been, let's say, constructive over the course of Turkish history. So how Turkey decides to align itself is a fascinating conversation that I'd love to get into. But we're going to do all of that in the second part of the conversation, Ryan. For anyone who is new to the program, Hidden Forces is listener-supported. We don't accept advertisers or commercial sponsors. The entire show is funded from top to bottom by listeners like you. If you want access to the second part of today's conversation with Ryan, as well as the episode transcripts and intelligence reports, head over to hiddenforces.io and check out our episode library, where you can also become a premium subscriber today. Ryan, stick around. We're going to move the second half of our conversation onto the premium feed. For more information about this week's episode, or if you want easy access to related programming, visit our website at hiddenforces.io and subscribe to our free email list. If you want access to full episodes, transcripts, and intelligence reports, which include additional notes, resources, links, and other material that will help you get the most out of each and every episode, check out our premium subscription, available through the Hidden Forces website at hiddenforces.io. Today's episode was produced by me and edited by Stylianos Nikolaou. For more episodes, you can check out our website at hiddenforces.io. Join the conversation at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Hidden Forces Pod, or send me an email at dk@hiddenforces.io. As always, thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.